She was just another passenger, quietly sitting in her seat. But when the flight crew decided to humiliate her, they had no idea who they were really dealing with. What happened next would shake the airline to its core, and the crew had no way of knowing just minutes after they mistreated her, they were about to regret it all. Big time. Before we start, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more awesome videos. It was supposed to be just another ordinary flight, the kind that people took every day without giving it much thought. Ava Carter, a teenage girl from a small town, had been traveling alone for the first time. As she boarded the plane, her calm and composed demeanor made her blend in with the rest of the passengers. With her natural curls framing her face and a neat blazer draped over her slender shoulders, she was every bit the image of confidence. She had a leather laptop bag in one hand, her boarding pass in the other, and as she made her way down the aisle, she glanced up at the seat numbers to find her place. No one seemed to pay her much attention, and that suited Ava just fine. She arrived at her seat in the first-class cabin and smiled politely at the passenger sitting next to her. He smiled back, unaware of the trouble that was about to unfold. Ava stowed her bag in the overhead compartment and sat down, pulling out a small notebook and pen. She had a few things to work on, notes for school and maybe some thoughts she wanted to jot down. She didn't seem to notice the curious glances from other passengers. For Ava, this flight was just another step toward adulthood, a quiet, peaceful journey with no interruptions. But little did she know, her experience on this plane would become anything but ordinary. As the plane's engines hummed softly, one of the flight attendants, Miranda Scott, moved briskly down the aisle. Miranda, sharp-eyed and meticulous, was known for her attention to detail, and she was particularly focused on the passengers in first class. Her gaze landed on Ava, and there was something about her that immediately caught Miranda's attention. It wasn't the girl's appearance. No, it was more the way she carried herself, so poised, so calm. Miranda's instincts told her something wasn't quite right, but she couldn't place it. She stopped near Ava's seat, her sharp eyes scanning the young girl. "Excuse me," Miranda said in a tone that was polite, but carried an edge. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Ava looked up, surprised but unfazed. She handed over her boarding pass with a small smile. "Of course." Miranda took it, her eyes briefly scanning the details. She frowned. "This is for first class?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "Yes," Ava replied simply, her voice steady and calm. Miranda's frown deepened as she processed the ticket, her mind running through a list of possible explanations. She handed the boarding pass back to Ava, though her lips were pressed into a tight line. Without saying another word, she walked away, but something was off. Ava could sense it, though she shrugged it off and went back to her notes, her pen gliding across the paper. Miranda, meanwhile, didn't go far. She spoke quietly with another flight attendant near the galley, casting occasional glances back toward Ava. There was an unmistakable look of discomfort on Miranda's face, even though she didn't know exactly why. Whatever it was about Ava, it bothered her. It nagged at her. It wasn't until a few moments later that Miranda returned, her demeanor different, more authoritative, more sure of herself. She stopped beside Ava's seat once again. "Miss Carter," she began, her voice firmer now, "could you please step aside for a moment? I need to verify something." Ava blinked in surprise but remained calm. She nodded slightly, stood up, and gathered her things. As she followed Miranda toward the galley, the other passengers exchanged curious glances. Ava, though, didn't seem to notice. She kept her head high, walking with a quiet grace. The two women moved down the narrow aisle, the whispers growing louder as Ava passed. When they reached the back of the plane, Miranda gestured toward an empty seat in the main cabin. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a different seat," she said, her tone turning colder. "There seems to have been a mistake with your booking." Ava's brow furrowed slightly. "A mistake?" she asked, her voice calm but tinged with confusion. I don't think so. I booked this ticket weeks ago and it was confirmed. Miranda's tone hardened. I've already checked. I don't think this seat is appropriate for you. You'll need to sit in the main cabin. Ava's face shifted, her expression now a mix of disbelief and annoyance, but she didn't raise her voice. Instead, she simply nodded once, a quiet signal of compliance. I don't understand why, but fine. She walked toward the back of the plane, her grip on her laptop bag tightening ever so slightly as she made her way toward the empty seat Miranda had indicated. The entire cabin seemed to be watching now, the whispers growing louder as she passed. Ava remained composed, not letting the discomfort show on her face, but there was a noticeable change in her posture. As she walked down the aisle, she could feel the stares of the other passengers, some sympathetic, some curious. She sat down in the empty seat, the discomfort of the cramped space pressing against her. She placed her bag under the seat and sat back, her mind racing. Somewhere between frustration and disbelief, Ava could feel the weight of the situation, but she didn't react. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, tapping quickly across the screen. The message she sent would soon set things in motion, though no one around her knew that yet. Miranda, meanwhile, returned to her duties, still unaware of the ripple effect she had just set into motion. As she moved through the cabin, checking on other passengers and ensuring drinks were served, her thoughts kept drifting back to Ava. There was something about the girl's calmness that unsettled Miranda. She had expected a confrontation, an argument even, but Ava had remained silent, composed. It didn't sit right with her. At the same time, Ava sat in her new seat, staring out the window, the clouds drifting by. She kept her focus on her phone, typing again, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. The faintest smile played on her lips as she finished the message, her calm exterior hiding the storm she knew was coming. The battle wasn't over. It had just begun. The minutes on the plane stretched on as Ava remained calm, the hum of the engines and the soft chatter around her filling the space. Miranda, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in her gut. The interaction with Ava, something about it didn't feel right. She had been too quick to make a judgment. The calmness of the young girl, almost unnerving in its precision, kept her mind racing, and that uneasy feeling lingered in the back of her mind like a shadow. Meanwhile, Ava was far from distracted. She sat back in her cramped seat, her fingers occasionally tapping against the armrest as she continued to observe the cabin. She was aware of the tension, of the looks she was getting, but it didn't faze her. There was something deeply strategic in her stillness, a sense that she was in full control of the situation. She wasn't upset, she wasn't angry, she wasn't even frustrated. She was simply waiting for the right moment. Miranda, still moving through the cabin, tried to shake off her own feelings of doubt, focusing on her duties. But she couldn't stop glancing at Ava. The teen's composed manner, her cool indifference to the obvious discomfort she was being forced to endure, it didn't match the narrative Miranda had built in her head. Something was off. But Miranda wasn't going to admit it. Not yet. She had already made her decision. Ava was just another passenger after all. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the murmurs among the passengers began to grow. A few seemed to sympathize with Ava, but none dared to speak out loud. The young girl sat motionless, her attention fixed on her phone, her expression unreadable. She was making no attempt to engage with the cabin, yet everyone seemed to sense that she wasn't just a normal passenger. She was something more. Miranda tried to focus on her responsibilities, serving drinks, ensuring the first-class passengers were comfortable, but her mind kept returning to Ava. She couldn't understand it. Why was she so composed? The girl had been moved from a perfectly good seat. She should have been upset, but instead she was almost satisfied. Miranda's thoughts were interrupted by another flight attendant, Clara, who had come to check on Ava, offering her a drink. Clara was much more sympathetic than Miranda had been, but Ava simply smiled and declined the offer. "Just water, please," she said softly, her tone polite but distant. Clara, though, could see something in Ava's eyes, a calmness that made her seem like she was holding something back, but she couldn't figure out what it was. She placed the water on Ava's tray table and moved away, but not before giving the girl one last glance. Miranda, from her place near the galley, watched the interaction from a distance. She couldn't help but notice the stark difference between the way Ava interacted with Clara and how she had responded to Miranda earlier. Ava had been cold, but it wasn't the kind of coldness that came from anger. No, it was something else, something far more unsettling. As the flight continued, Miranda could feel the situation slipping from her control. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It wasn't about the misplaced boarding pass or the misunderstanding. Something much larger was unfolding, and she had no idea what was coming. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a mistake. Something told her that the consequences of her actions were going to be far greater than anything she had anticipated. The flight continued its steady course, and Ava remained untouched by the discomfort of her situation. She looked out the window, the clouds parting beneath them, her thoughts clearly focused on something beyond the small cabin around her. But there was something else in the air, something Miranda couldn't quite pinpoint. As the plane cruised, the unsettling calm of the entire situation grew. Miranda's thoughts, once filled with the certainty of her actions, were now clouded with doubt. Then came the announcement over the intercom. The flight was progressing smoothly, and they would soon be preparing for the descent. For most passengers, it was routine, but for Miranda, it was the breaking point. She had spent the entire flight trying to manage the growing unease, but now, with the final stretch approaching, it felt like something was shifting, a tide she couldn't control. As she walked through the cabin, Miranda passed by Ava's seat once again. This time, their eyes met. Ava's calm, composed gaze met Miranda's, and for just a second, Miranda felt something shift in the air. It wasn't defiance or anger that she saw in Ava's eyes. It was a quiet confidence, a certainty that made Miranda's stomach tighten. It was as if Ava already knew the end of the story, and Miranda had no idea what was coming. The flight continued its descent, and Miranda's nerves only grew sharper. She couldn't stop thinking about that look in Ava's eyes. It haunted her. What was it? What did Ava know? She had dismissed the girl earlier, judged her without cause, and now the realization was starting to hit. This wasn't just about a seating mix-up. This was about something much bigger. Back in the main cabin, Ava's stillness only added to the tension. While the passengers shifted in their seats, preparing for landing, Ava remained unchanged. She crossed her legs with practiced ease and picked up the in-flight magazine, flipping through it absently, but her every movement seemed calculated, deliberate. She wasn't distracted by the whispers of passengers or the increasing unease that rippled through the cabin. Instead, she seemed to be preparing herself for something, perhaps the moment when everything would change. Miranda, meanwhile, had returned to the galley, trying to distract herself with routine tasks, but even the simple act of serving drinks felt forced. She knew that something wasn't right, but she couldn't put her finger on it. It was only when she noticed the crew around her exchanging glances that the full weight of the situation began to settle on her. There were too many signs that something was about to happen, but Miranda couldn't decipher them. And then, just as the plane began its final descent, the call came. The flight attendant's phone buzzed, a quiet but sharp interruption to the quiet hum of the galley. Miranda's hands froze as she picked up the receiver. A voice on the other end spoke in a calm, official tone. It was the airline's executive office. The words came like a punch to the gut. Ava Carter's name was mentioned, and a new order came through. "We've received a complaint. We need a detailed report from you as soon as we land. For now, ensure that all passengers are treated respectfully." The words echoed in Miranda's mind, but they didn't make sense at first. Ava? The girl who had been moved to the back of the plane? The teen who had barely said a word? It didn't add up. But the tone and the voice on the other end was firm. Ava Carter wasn't just any passenger. She was someone important, someone whose complaint was being taken seriously by the highest levels of the airline. Miranda's heart raced as she slowly placed the phone back in its cradle. The weight of what she had done hit her harder than any turbulence ever could. She had misjudged Ava. She had made a decision without knowing anything about the girl, and now she was facing the consequences. As Miranda made her way back to the cabin to finish preparing for landing, the reality of the situation hit her all at once. Ava wasn't just some regular passenger. She was someone with connections, powerful connections. And now Miranda was realizing just how deeply her mistake was going to cost her. She had humiliated the wrong person, and now the whole flight crew would have to deal with the fallout. Ava, meanwhile, sat calmly in her seat, eyes closed for a moment, as if savoring the quiet before the storm. She knew exactly what was unfolding, and it wasn't over yet. The quiet confidence that had marked her from the beginning was still there, but now it was accompanied by a faint smile of satisfaction. She had already won. As the plane began its final descent, the tension in the cabin was nearly palpable. The usual chatter had died down, and the passengers were now focused on the impending landing. Ava, however, sat with an eerie calm, as if the events of the flight had been nothing more than a small bump in the road for her. She continued to glance out the window, the landscape below growing clearer as they neared their destination. Miranda, on the other hand, felt like she was slowly drowning in her own nervousness. She moved through the aisles, checking seat belts and collecting trays, but her movements felt mechanical, nothing like her usual confident stride. Every time she passed Ava's seat, she couldn't help but glance at the young girl who seemed more and more like someone she should have never crossed. The knot in her stomach grew tighter with every step. The incident was far from over. In fact, Miranda knew that it was just beginning. Ava, aware of Miranda's growing unease, remained unfazed. She had already sent a final message, her fingers moving quickly across her phone screen, her expression neutral. The message was short but deliberate. There was no need for further communication until it was time. Once she pressed send, she slid the phone back into her bag and leaned back in her seat, arms crossed casually over her chest. Ava looked like someone who was simply waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. The flight attendants were bustling around, preparing for the final stretch, but Miranda's focus was nowhere near her duties. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. She had no idea what it was, but the sudden reminder that Ava was someone with power, someone connected, kept gnawing at her. When the captain's voice came over the intercom, it seemed to cut through Miranda's anxiety like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your trays are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Miranda's hands trembled as she moved to collect the last of the drinks, but every glance she took toward the front of the cabin landed on Ava, still seated quietly in her seat, poised and composed. That small, knowing smile from earlier kept flashing in her mind, unsettling her. It was as if Ava was aware of something that Miranda wasn't, something far beyond her control. Meanwhile, Ava had shifted her focus again, taking a small sip of water from the glass that Clara had brought her earlier. Her eyes flickered briefly toward Miranda, who was moving through the cabin with a strange, stiffened air. Ava's lips parted for a moment, as if she were about to speak, but she stopped herself, her gaze locking with Miranda's for a brief second. There was no malice in her eyes, only calm, quiet recognition. Ava didn't have to say anything. She didn't need to. The moment of connection was enough. Miranda felt a chill run down her spine. Ava was playing a game, and Miranda had no idea what the rules were. The rest of the flight crew, still unaware of the deeper layers of what was going on, continued their tasks. But Dennis, a senior flight attendant, had been watching Miranda closely. He'd noticed the change in her demeanor since the phone call from the executive office. Miranda wasn't her usual self. There was something about the way she was carrying herself that spoke volumes. Dennis couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew something was wrong. As the plane finally touched down with a smooth landing, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. The usual bustle of passengers unbuckling their seatbelts and grabbing their belongings filled the air, but for Miranda, it felt different. Her mind was racing. She couldn't stop thinking about the moment Ava had glanced up at her earlier, that small, confident smile. The implication was clear now. Ava wasn't just some privileged teenager with a lucky seat in first class. She was someone with the kind of connections that could tear apart an entire airline if she so wished. And Miranda was quickly realizing that her actions had set in motion something that no one could control. As passengers began to file off the plane, Ava remained seated for a moment longer. She waited until the aisle was nearly empty before slowly standing and gathering her things with a careful, deliberate precision. She moved with a grace that was unmistakable, nothing rushed, nothing frantic. Ava was in control of the situation, and everyone around her could feel it. Miranda, still on edge, stood near the exit, forcing a smile as the passengers passed by her. She watched Ava approach, her heart pounding in her chest. When they reached each other, Miranda did her best to maintain her composure. "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Carter," she said, her voice strained, the smile on her lips a little too tight. Ava paused just before walking out, her eyes locking with Miranda's. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," she said, her voice calm, but the weight of her words hung in the air like a silent threat. Without another word, she walked off the plane, leaving Miranda frozen in place. Miranda's eyes stayed fixed on the door, but her mind was spinning. She had no idea what was coming next. She only knew that she had crossed the wrong person, and she was about to find out just how much that mistake would cost her. As Ava walked through the terminal, she glanced down at her phone, quickly typing a message. It wasn't a long message, just a confirmation of what had happened. Ava had no time to waste. Everything was already in motion, and there was no turning back now. As she stepped into a sleek black sedan outside the terminal, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. What had started as a humiliating ordeal for her daughter had turned into an opportunity for real, lasting change. It wasn't over yet, but it was already clear the flight crew's actions had set off a chain reaction, and the consequences were about to unfold in ways no one could have anticipated. Back inside the airport, Miranda stood still, her hands trembling slightly as she watched the last of the passengers leave. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on her, something she couldn't control. And she was right. Because moments later, two security officers entered the plane, scanning the cabin with purposeful eyes. "Are you Miranda Scott?" one of them asked. Miranda's stomach dropped as she turned toward the two uniformed security officers who had just stepped onto the plane. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. The weight of the situation crashed down on her all at once, and her breath caught in her throat. She had been expecting trouble, but this was different. "Yes," she managed to reply, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart was pounding now, every beat a reminder of the mistake she had made. The officers didn't say anything else. They just looked at her with steely eyes, their presence commanding immediate attention. She could feel the eyes of the remaining crew on her, though no one dared to speak. It was as if the air itself had thickened, and Miranda was the only one who couldn't breathe. "We need you to come with us," one of the officers said firmly. "We have some questions regarding an incident on this flight." Miranda's legs felt weak as she stepped toward them. Her mind was spinning, and she could hardly register the cold look they gave her. She had hoped, in the back of her mind, that maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe it was just a routine check. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. Her hands trembled as she followed the officers off the plane, the stares of the remaining crew members lingering on her back. She walked slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. Her uniform, once a symbol of pride and professionalism, now felt like a badge of shame. She had been so sure of herself earlier, so convinced that she was just following protocol, but now all that confidence was gone. All she had left was the sinking feeling in her gut that she had made an irreversible mistake. The officers escorted her through the terminal, their silence making the whole situation feel even more surreal. Miranda glanced around, seeing the faces of passengers as they walked past her. Some were too distracted to notice, while others seemed to study her, their eyes filled with curiosity, judgment, or a mix of both. But no one spoke. It was as if they all understood that something had gone terribly wrong. When they finally reached a small, isolated room in the back of the terminal, the officers gestured for her to sit at a table. It was cold in the room, and the walls felt like they were closing in on her. Miranda sat down mechanically, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap, her legs trembling beneath the table. The officers didn't sit at first. They just stood there, watching her with a quiet intensity, as if they were waiting for her to speak first. For a long moment, Miranda didn't say anything. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but the weight of the situation kept her frozen in place. She had no idea what was coming, but she knew it wouldn't be good. The consequences of her actions were unfolding before her, and she was powerless to stop them. Finally, one of the officers spoke. "Miss Scott, we've been informed of an incident involving a first-class passenger on your flight. The airline's executive office has received a formal complaint." Miranda's heart skipped a beat. Ava's name immediately flashed through her mind, and she realized, with a cold rush of dread, that this was it. This was the moment when everything would change. I didn't mean for this to happen," Miranda said quickly, her voice shaking slightly. "I was just doing my job." The officer leaned in, his expression unreadable. "Your job?" he repeated. "According to our records, Miss Carter had a valid first-class ticket. What exactly made you think it was appropriate to move her?" Miranda opened her mouth to explain, but the words stuck in her throat. She wanted to say it was a mistake, that she had been following the rules, but deep down, she knew that wasn't the truth. Her actions hadn't been about protocol, they had been about something else, something that she couldn't bring herself to admit. I didn't think she belonged there," Miranda finally admitted, her voice barely audible. The officer's eyes hardened. "And what exactly did you mean by that?" Miranda swallowed hard. She had no answer. She couldn't explain it. It had been an instinct, a snap judgment based on the way Ava looked and acted, but now, as she sat there, she realized how wrong it had been, how unfair, how prejudiced. The silence stretched on as the officer stared at her. Miranda could feel the weight of his gaze, the judgment in his eyes. It was like the room had shrunk, and she was the only person inside it. Her career, her reputation, it was all on the line now. And for what? A mistake she had made in a moment of insecurity? A judgment she had passed on someone she didn't even know? The officer finally broke the silence. "Miss Carter is not just any passenger. She is a major shareholder and a high-ranking executive with this airline." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Your actions have put the airline in a very difficult position." Miranda felt her breath catch in her throat. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I had no idea." The officer nodded, his expression tight. "That's the problem. You made an assumption based on what? Her appearance? Her demeanor? Miss Carter's complaint has already reached the board, and they take these matters very seriously. You're fortunate that the situation has been handled internally for now, But there will be an investigation. Miranda sat in stunned silence. The reality of her actions was starting to sink in, and with it came the full weight of the consequences she was about to face. It wasn't just about her mistake anymore. It was about something bigger, about the power dynamics she had failed to recognize, about the biases that had led her to act the way she had. And now it was too late to take any of it back. Her mind was reeling as the officer's words echoed in her head. An investigation. The word sounded like a death sentence to her career. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built up, was suddenly on the verge of falling apart. She had crossed the wrong person, and now she would have to pay the price. As the officers left the room, Miranda's hands shook. Her career was hanging by a thread, and she had no idea what the next steps would be. What she did know, however, was that nothing would ever be the same again. Miranda sat alone in the small, sterile room, the silence pressing in on her like a heavy weight. She had been left there with her thoughts, and the reality of what was happening was starting to settle in. Her mind raced as she replayed every detail of the flight. The way she had dismissed Ava, the assumptions she had made about her based on nothing more than her appearance, none of it made sense anymore. But it was too late. The damage had been done. She tried to steady her breathing, but it was hard. The sound of her own heartbeat seemed to echo in the silence. She had spent years working her way up in the airline industry, always following the rules, always doing her job with precision. But now it all felt like it had been for nothing. All of her years of hard work, all of her dedication, it was all unraveling because of one bad decision, one mistake that she couldn't undo. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. Miranda looked up, her heart skipping a beat. She had no idea what to expect now. The officers from earlier had left, but she knew she hadn't heard the last of them. They had said the investigation would be thorough, and that meant her every move was about to be scrutinized. The door opened, and a man in a dark suit entered. He was older, his face stern, and his eyes immediately locked onto Miranda, as if he had already made up his mind about her. He didn't introduce himself at first. He simply pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. "Miranda Scott," he began, his voice low but firm. "I'm with the airline's disciplinary committee. We've been reviewing the events from your flight today." He didn't wait for a response, instead continuing with a question that felt more like a statement. "Tell me, why did you think it was appropriate to move Miss Carter from her seat in first class?" Miranda opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She had tried to explain herself before, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no valid explanation. She had assumed things about Ava, judged her based on nothing but her own biases. She could feel the weight of the mistake pressing down on her, and for the first time, she realized the true cost of her actions. "I didn't mean to cause any harm," she finally managed, her voice shaky. "I thought she was in the wrong seat. I was just trying to follow the procedure." The man across from her didn't flinch. He simply leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. "You thought she was in the wrong seat?" he repeated. "Miss Carter was seated in a first-class seat with a valid first-class ticket. You didn't verify that before you asked her to move?" Miranda shook her head, her throat dry. "No, I didn't," she admitted. I made an assumption." The man's expression didn't change. "Assumptions," he muttered, as if the word itself was something to be feared. "You made an assumption about a passenger based on what? Her age? Her appearance?" Miranda could feel her face burning with shame. She had no good answer. She had assumed Ava didn't belong in first class because of the way she looked. Young, calm, unassuming. Ava had made no fuss when Miranda asked her to move, which should have been a clue that something wasn't right, but Miranda hadn't questioned it. Instead, she had acted without thinking, without considering the consequences. The man continued, his tone growing colder. "Your actions today were discriminatory. They reflect a deep-seated bias that we cannot tolerate, especially not in our staff. This incident has already been escalated to the highest levels of the airline. You are under investigation now." and your future with this company is uncertain." Miranda's chest tightened as the words sank in. The reality of the situation was becoming painfully clear. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had made a decision based on unconscious prejudice, and now she was facing the consequences. The man stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "You will receive a formal letter with the outcome of the investigation. Until then, you're suspended from duty." As he left the room, Miranda remained seated, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She could feel the weight of the suspension settling over her like a heavy cloud. Her career was in jeopardy. Everything she had worked for was now hanging by a thread. She had crossed the wrong person, and now she had to face the fallout. Ava Carter had quietly turned the tables on her, and Miranda had no idea just how much her life was about to change. The investigation would continue, and the truth of her actions would be revealed. But what truly struck Miranda now was that Ava hadn't needed to shout, to cause a scene, or even to fight back. Ava had simply remained calm, poised, and in control, something Miranda could never have anticipated. Miranda sat alone in the cold room, the minutes stretching on endlessly. There was no more running from her actions. There was no more pretending it hadn't happened. The consequences were now inevitable, and all Miranda could do was wait for the inevitable to unfold. Miranda's suspension weighed heavily on her as the hours passed. She had been escorted off the plane, humiliated in front of her colleagues, and now she found herself sitting in her small, empty apartment, staring blankly at the television. The news was on, but she couldn't focus on it. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Ava, the calm teenager who had been so polite, so composed, and yet someone with a power Miranda had never imagined. The more Miranda thought about it, the more she realized how deep her mistake had gone. She hadn't just embarrassed herself, she had embarrassed the entire airline. Her actions weren't just a minor inconvenience, they were a reflection of a systemic issue, prejudice, bias, and the way assumptions were made about people based on appearance. Ava, who Miranda had assumed didn't belong in first class, wasn't just any passenger. She was part of something much bigger, and Miranda had made a careless, prejudiced judgment without ever considering the consequences. She paced back and forth in her living room, the walls closing in around her. Her phone buzzed, and she picked it up, hoping for something, anything, that might bring a glimmer of hope. But it was just a message from a coworker asking if she was okay. The truth was, Miranda wasn't okay. She had no idea what was coming next, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy. The doorbell rang, and Miranda jumped. She wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment she hesitated, her heart racing. She opened the door to find a man in a suit standing on her doorstep, someone she didn't recognize. He introduced himself as a representative from the airline's legal department. "We need to speak with you," he said, his tone grave. "It's about the incident on Flight 287. We've been instructed to gather statements and begin a formal investigation into your actions." Miranda's heart sank. She had been expecting this, but now that it was happening, the weight of the situation felt real in a way it hadn't before. She nodded slowly, stepping aside to let the man in. As he walked past her, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle over her. The representative from the airline's legal department sat across from Miranda at her kitchen table, his demeanor calm but unyielding. He pulled out a notebook, ready to take notes. Miranda sat there, her hands trembling slightly, unsure of what to say. Every word she spoke felt like it could be another nail in the coffin of her career. "Miss Scott," the representative began, "we are conducting a thorough review of the incident on Flight 287. I'm sure you're aware of the seriousness of this matter. We need to get your side of the story." Miranda nodded, her throat dry. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said quietly. "I thought I was just doing my job. I moved the passenger because I thought she didn't belong in first class." The representative raised an eyebrow. "You thought she didn't belong? Based on what? Her age?" Her appearance? Miranda hesitated, feeling the sting of the question. It was hard to admit, but she had to face the truth. I assumed she wasn't in the right seat. I didn't check her ticket properly, and I let my instincts get the better of me. The representative scribbled something down in his notebook before looking back at her. And those instincts, as you call them, led to a decision that not only caused the passenger distress, but also jeopardized the airline's reputation. This isn't just about a mistake anymore. We're looking at potential violations of company policy and possibly more serious matters. You were supposed to treat all passengers with respect regardless of their background. Miranda's stomach churned. The words felt like a blow. She had failed in the most fundamental aspect of her job, respecting her passengers. And now, that failure was costing her more than she could have imagined. I didn't mean to be disrespectful, Miranda said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize who she was, but I still shouldn't have treated her that way. I see that now. The representative nodded but didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be taking his time, considering something. When he finally spoke again, his voice was more measured. Miss Carter, the passenger you moved, is a major shareholder in this airline, and she has already filed a formal complaint. The board has taken a personal interest in this matter, and your actions have already sparked a larger conversation about bias within the company. You need to understand that this is more than just an internal matter. The public is now aware of this situation, and it's going to affect how the airline is perceived. Miranda felt like she was sinking. She had heard the whispers before, about the board, about the powerful people behind the scenes. But she had never imagined she would find herself in the middle of it, dealing with the fallout from an innocent mistake. I'm sorry, Miranda said, her voice cracking. I know it's not enough, but I am truly sorry. The representative didn't respond right away. He simply closed his notebook and stood up. The investigation will continue, Miss Scott. You'll be notified of the outcome once all the facts are gathered. In the meantime, please do not contact any other employees or discuss the matter further. You'll be hearing from us soon. Miranda sat there, her mind numb, as the door closed behind the representative. She couldn't escape the reality of what she had done. The investigation, the press, the endless questioning. She was trapped in a web of her own making, and she had no idea how she would get out of it. The shame weighed heavily on her, and for the first time, she wondered if her career in the airline industry was truly over. She glanced at the phone on the table, the buzzing message alerts waiting for her to face them. Ava's calmness haunted her thoughts. She had underestimated Ava, assumed she didn't belong in first class. And now, as the investigation continued, Miranda realized just how deeply her own biases had influenced her actions. She wasn't sure where the road ahead would take her, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never forget this lesson, and neither would anyone else. Days passed, but Miranda found little solace in the passing time. She was trapped in a limbo, suspended from her job, and surrounded by the looming consequences of her actions. Each message that buzzed on her phone only reminded her of the growing storm. The investigation was moving forward, and every minute she spent thinking about it only made her feel more powerless. The initial shock had worn off, but the reality of what she'd done remained sharp. Miranda couldn't help but think about the way she had judged Ava. Her assumptions, her bias, it had all come flooding back. At first, she had justified it by telling herself that she had followed protocol, but the more she reflected, the more she realized how deeply her actions had been influenced by unconscious prejudice. She hadn't seen Ava for who she truly was, an executive, a powerful figure who had every right to be in first class. She had only seen what she expected to see. Miranda sat on her couch, staring blankly at the wall when the phone rang. Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced at the screen. It was an unfamiliar number, but something told her this was the call she had been dreading. "Hello?" Miranda answered, her voice uncertain. "Miss Scott, came the voice on the other end. It was firm, but not unkind. "This is David Anderson from the airline's legal department. We need to meet regarding the ongoing investigation into the incident involving Miss Carter." Miranda swallowed, her mouth dry. "When? What do you need from me?" "We'd like to meet in person tomorrow morning," David said. "We'll discuss the next steps and how you intend to respond to the allegations. It's important that you come prepared with any relevant details." Miranda's mind was racing as the call ended. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The weight of her actions had already cost her so much, and now it seemed as though the fallout was about to hit its peak. She couldn't help but wonder if her apology, her regrets, if they would be enough to make any difference. Would the airline be willing to forgive her? Or was it too late to repair the damage she had caused? She couldn't bring herself to pick up her phone again. It felt like everything was spinning out of control, like she was standing on the edge of a precipice with no way back. The next morning, Miranda stood in front of the full-length mirror in her apartment, trying to steady her breath. She had chosen a professional outfit, something that would make her appear calm and composed, but nothing could hide the storm that was raging inside her. Her hands shook as she adjusted her blouse, and she couldn't shake the feeling that today would be the day that determined her future. The meeting at the airline's headquarters was set for 10 a.m., and she knew it would be her last chance to salvage anything from this disaster. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for could be on the line. But despite the knots in her stomach, Miranda knew she had to face this head-on. There was no avoiding it anymore. As she arrived at the headquarters, the sleek, glass-fronted building seemed to tower over her. She walked through the glass doors and was met by a receptionist who directed her to the waiting area. It was quiet in the lobby, with only a few other employees moving about, their footsteps echoing on the polished floors. Miranda's palms were sweating as she sat down, her eyes darting nervously to the clock. She was early, but every minute felt like an eternity. The door opened, and David Anderson walked in, his face unreadable. "Miss Scott," he said, giving her a polite nod. "Please follow me." Miranda rose from her seat and followed him down a long corridor. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she kept her head high, reminding herself that this was the moment of truth. She had no idea what was going to happen, but she had to stay strong. She had to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how difficult it was. They entered a large conference room where several senior figures from the airline's legal department were already seated. Miranda was told to sit at the end of the long table, facing them all. The atmosphere was tense, and the silence in the room felt suffocating. David sat across from her, flipping open a folder and placing it on the table. "Miss Scott," he began, his voice calm but serious, "we've reviewed the incident thoroughly. You are aware that your actions toward Miss Carter were not just unprofessional, they were discriminatory. As you know, she has made a formal complaint, and the matter has been escalated to the highest levels of the company. Our primary concern now is the impact your actions have had on the airline's reputation." Miranda nodded, her throat dry. "I understand. I know what I did was wrong. I shouldn't have judged her the way I did. I made a mistake. I'm sorry." David glanced at the other members of the team before continuing. "Miss Carter is a major shareholder, as well as a high-ranking executive within the airline. Her complaint, along with the testimonies from passengers on the flight, has already made waves within the company. The board is taking this very seriously." Miranda's chest tightened as the gravity of the situation sank in. This wasn't just about her job anymore. The consequences of her actions had affected the entire company. She felt a cold rush of panic, but she tried to keep her composure. "We need to know," David continued, "how you plan to take responsibility for your actions moving forward. What steps are you willing to take to show that this was not just a lapse in judgment, but a genuine understanding of the mistake you've made?" Miranda's mind raced. What could she possibly say that would make a difference now? Would an apology be enough? Would they even care? She had no way of knowing, but the truth was clear. Her apology alone wouldn't fix the damage she had caused. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," she said, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I've already started to reflect on my actions and the biases that influenced my decision. I want to make amends. I'll attend any training programs, do anything that might help fix what I've broken." David exchanged a look with the others around the table, but Miranda couldn't read their expressions. The silence stretched on, leaving her to wonder what her fate would be. Would they accept her apology, or would this be the end of her career? The weight was unbearable, and Miranda knew that, for better or worse, she had done everything she could to right her wrongs. The minutes felt like hours as Miranda sat there waiting for the next move. The silence in the room was suffocating. Every time she glanced at the legal team, their unreadable expressions only added to her anxiety. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat growing louder in her ears. She had come to the meeting hoping for a chance to explain herself, to make things right. But now, with each passing second, she was starting to realize just how much she had underestimated the gravity of the situation. David, who had been leading the conversation, flipped through the folder in front of him. He was quiet for a moment, studying the pages as if weighing something important. The others around the table exchanged looks, and Miranda couldn't help but feel the weight of their judgment. It was clear now her future was hanging by a thread, and she had no control over what would happen next. Finally, David broke the silence. "Miss Scott, we've discussed your case at length," he said, his voice still calm but now carrying a certain weight. "While your actions were unacceptable, we also understand that this situation was driven by a lack of awareness rather than malicious intent. However, that doesn't excuse the fact that you made a decision based on assumptions that were not only wrong but discriminatory." Miranda's chest tightened. She had anticipated harsh words, but hearing them from David, who had been so composed throughout, made them even harder to bear. She had assumed the worst, but this felt even worse, like a betrayal of everything she thought she stood for. "You've already expressed your remorse, and we acknowledge that," David continued, his tone softer now. "But the airline cannot simply overlook the damage caused by your actions. We need more than just words. We need concrete steps to ensure this doesn't happen again." Miranda nodded quickly, eager to show that she was willing to do whatever it took. "I understand. I'm ready to take full responsibility. I'll participate in sensitivity training, diversity workshops, anything that helps me recognize and correct the biases I acted on." The room was still for a long moment. David's eyes softened, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he turned to the others, seated at the table, exchanging silent glances. Miranda's anxiety grew with every second that passed. She had come to terms with the fact that this might cost her career, but she didn't want to leave this meeting empty-handed. She needed to show them she was more than just the mistake she had made. After what felt like an eternity, David spoke again. "The board has made a decision," he said, his voice firm again. "As of today, you are suspended indefinitely from your duties. This suspension will last until the completion of your sensitivity and bias training, and we will reassess your future with the company at that time." Miranda's heart sank. Indefinitely. The word echoed in her mind, each syllable a reminder that this was far from over. But at least, she thought, there was a chance to fix this. There was a chance for redemption. Miranda walked out of the building with a sense of numbness, her legs heavy with each step. She had been suspended, a decision that felt both like a punishment and, in some strange way, a relief. She hadn't been fired. The thought had crossed her mind countless times as she sat in that meeting, but now that the decision was made, all she could do was face the uncertainty that lay ahead. The cold air outside hit her face like a slap, sharp and immediate, but it didn't seem to faze her. The city around her continued as if nothing had changed. But for Miranda, everything had shifted. Her career was on hold. Her reputation was tarnished. She had made a mistake that she couldn't take back, and no matter what steps she took from here, it would follow her. Her phone buzzed again as she walked down the steps of the building, and she pulled it out, hoping for some message that might give her a sense of direction. It was a text from a friend, offering support. "Hang in there. It's going to be okay," it said. But Miranda wasn't sure if she believed that anymore. Could it be okay? Could her career in this industry ever recover from this? Her mind wandered back to Ava. Ava had been so calm throughout the entire ordeal, so composed. Miranda had underestimated her, thinking she was just another young, privileged passenger who didn't deserve to be treated like a VIP. But Ava wasn't just any passenger. Ava had connections, influence, power. And Miranda had learned the hard way that she wasn't someone to be messed with. Ava's quiet strength had left Miranda shaken. She had acted on assumptions, and now she was paying the price. But as she stood outside the building, with her suspension hanging over her like a dark cloud, Miranda felt a strange sense of clarity. Ava had taught her something without even trying. She had shown her how easy it was to fall into the trap of judging others based on appearances, of letting bias cloud your judgment. Miranda had done it, and now she had to face the consequences. She knew she had a long road ahead of her. The sensitivity training, the reassessment of her position, it would take time. But for the first time since the incident, Miranda felt a small spark of hope. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of a journey that, while difficult, could lead to real change. She took a deep breath, glancing at the city skyline in front of her. There was a lot of work to be done, both inside and outside of herself. But Miranda was determined to walk that road, even if it meant facing the reality of her mistakes and making things right. Weeks passed, and the weight of the suspension lingered over Miranda. She spent her days in a haze of self-reflection and uncomfortable silence, awaiting the call that would either signal her redemption or further confirm her fears. The sensitivity training, while necessary, felt like a daily reminder of the mistakes she had made. She went through the motions, attending classes and workshops, but it was never easy. Her mind constantly drifted back to the day she had moved Ava to the back of the plane. The memories still stung. Ava's calm, unwavering gaze, the way Miranda had acted based on assumptions, the way she had assumed that a young black woman didn't belong in first class. The thought of her own prejudices, her own biases, made her feel like she was peeling back layers of herself that she wasn't sure she wanted to see. But she knew that facing it was the only way to grow. She had to understand why she had made those decisions, why she had acted without question or hesitation. And then, one day, the call came. The phone buzzed, and Miranda's heart skipped a beat when she saw the number. It was from the airline's HR department. "Hello, Miss Scott. This is Carla from HR. We'd like to inform you that the investigation into your actions has been completed, and the board has made a decision regarding your future with the company." Miranda's stomach twisted into knots. She could hardly breathe as Carla continued. "The board has reviewed your progress during the sensitivity training and your efforts to understand and address the biases that influenced your actions. As a result, we've decided to lift your suspension. You will be reinstated to your previous position, but with new responsibilities. Moving forward, you will be working closely with the company's diversity and inclusion team to help prevent incidents like this from occurring again. Additionally, we will be assigning you a mentor to guide you through this transition." Miranda's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She had prepared herself for the worst, to be fired or permanently relegated to the sidelines. But this was a second chance. "Thank you," Miranda said, her voice shaky but filled with a mix of relief and gratitude. "I won't let you down. I'll do whatever it takes." The decision to reinstate Miranda didn't come without its challenges. There were still whispers among her colleagues, some who felt she had gotten off easy, others who simply couldn't forget the actions that had led to her suspension. But Miranda didn't focus on the noise. She had learned an important lesson through this process. Change wasn't about waiting for others to forgive you. It was about proving to yourself that you could be better. Her first day back at the airline's headquarters was filled with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. She walked through the doors with her head held high, determined to show that she was ready to take on the responsibility of helping to create a more inclusive and respectful environment. The diversity and inclusion team, along with her assigned mentor, met with her regularly. They gave her the tools to not only recognize her own biases, but also help others do the same. As part of her new role, Miranda led several training sessions for other employees, sharing her own experience to demonstrate how easy it was to fall into the trap of assumptions and prejudice. She used her story to explain why it was so important to treat every passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. At first, it was difficult for her to open up about the incident, but as time went on, she found strength in her vulnerability. She knew that by sharing her own mistakes, she could help others avoid making the same ones. Meanwhile, Ava had moved on with her life, using the incident as a catalyst to push for real change within the airline industry. She continued her work as an executive, overseeing the company's commitment to diversity and equality. Her influence was undeniable, and as she worked with the airline's board, she made sure that policies would be put in place to address the very issues Miranda had faced. Though their paths had diverged, Ava's actions had sparked something within Miranda, a sense of responsibility to make things right, not just for herself, but for everyone she interacted with. Ava had set the example, and now Miranda had to follow it. Months later, Miranda found herself standing in front of a large group of new employees, ready to lead another diversity training session. As she began speaking, she felt a sense of pride that had been absent for so long. She shared her story, how a single moment of prejudice had nearly cost her everything, and how she had used that failure to become a better version of herself. "It's easy to assume," Miranda said, her voice steady, "that we know who belongs where based on appearances. But the truth is, we never really know someone until we listen to them, until we understand their story. I made a mistake. I judged someone based on nothing more than my own assumptions, and that mistake almost destroyed everything I had worked for." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But it didn't end there. I chose to learn from it. I chose to change, and that is something we all have the power to do, every single day." The room was quiet as Miranda finished, and for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace with herself. The road had been long, and there were still moments when the memory of her mistake stung. But now she understood that those moments didn't define her. They had shaped her, yes, but they didn't control her. The applause that followed wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was genuine. Miranda could see the respect in the eyes of her colleagues, a silent acknowledgement that they saw her for who she was now, not who she had been. She had earned her second chance, and now she was using it to make a difference. A few weeks later, Miranda received a letter from the airline's executive office. It was a formal acknowledgement from the board thanking her for her hard work and dedication to creating a more inclusive and respectful environment. The letter didn't mention the incident directly, but it was clear that the airline recognized her efforts to help turn a negative experience into something positive. Miranda sat at her desk, the letter in her hands, and smiled. She had come a long way from the woman who had made assumptions about a passenger. Ava's actions had been the catalyst for change, but it was Miranda's willingness to face her mistakes that had allowed her to grow. In a strange way, she was grateful for everything that had happened. It had been painful, yes, but it had also been transformative. She had learned the hard way that no one was exempt from the dangers of prejudice, but also that everyone had the power to change. And with that knowledge, Miranda was committed to making sure that the same mistakes wouldn't happen again, not just in her life, but in the lives of everyone she worked with. As she leaned back in her chair, Miranda glanced out the window. The sky was clear, the sun shining brightly, and she felt a quiet sense of peace. The journey had been difficult, but it had brought her here, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that, no matter what, she had the power to make a difference. And that, she realized, was all that really mattered.